So, the science on COVID is rapidly emerging, but, to say that we know anything about it is erroneous, which is why I am so frustrated with the government and with the regulatory groups in medicine like the CDC and the NIH, and Johns Hopkins University now getting in on this. Now, we have universities that are declaring knowledge of how many people have died from COVID. That is scientifically impossible that they can say this many people died of COVID. We have a lot of people that are dying of bizarre respiratory conditions all the time. There seems to be a syndrome that is familiar with COVID, and that syndrome harkens back to another coronavirus of 2001, 2002 with SARS. And the description of SARS is so incredible in the literature. When you read the initial scientific studies coming out of 2002, 2003 around SARS, it literally says the patients turn blue and then have to wait until their lungs eventually fill with fluid and then they die. The course of events there is very important. They first turn blue before their lungs have fluid in them. And so there's not a respiratory failure that leads this thing. And then eventually with fluid in their lungs, they develop pneumonia and die. This is exactly what's happening with this COVID strain. So another coronavirus presenting with hypoxia, which is a loss of oxygen in tissue. So the patients are presenting blue and with these remarkably low numbers of oxygen, in the bloodstream. And yet a lot of them look pretty comfortable. They're not breathing fast. They're not, in any distress. And so the doctors are freaking out, trying to figure out, why is this patient sitting here talking to me with an oxygen level this low, blue in the face, and going into multi-organ failure? Liver is the number one thing. When they screened, there was a nice article that showed what is the initial laboratories of 5,000 patients presenting with COVID like symptoms in New York. Of those 5,000 patients, the vast majority didn't even have fever. The average temperature was 37 degrees Celsius, which is normal body temperature. And so they don't have fever, they don't have any signs of respiratory distress, and yet they have bump in liver enzymes. That's the only laboratory finding that seems to be consistent. Their white blood cells aren't elevated as if they have a virus. They don't have shift in triglycerides, suggesting some inflammatory event. And so there's nothing in that article I'm pouring through and show me the evidence that this person is having a viral infection. Show me the evidence that there's some signs in the immune system or otherwise that there's a virus afoot. Instead, they're dying of hypoxia. They have loss of oxygen at the tissue level, and their tissue is being starved of oxygen. And it turns out when you have a hypoxic injury, loss of oxygen in the lung, you get something called ground glass reaction. You get fluid that starts to accumulate in the lung because of that hypoxic injury, a lack of oxygen. In the vascular system, you start to get dysfunction of the endothelium, where you can no longer make vasodilatory effects, and you start to lose the mechanics of venous supply and venous drainage and all of this, and that leads to stasis, which you can get blood clots from stasis and all this. And so the whole body, from liver to bloodstream to your other organs, are showing signs, including the lungs, of a loss of oxygen. This looks as if you suddenly put this person on the top of Mount Everest and took them from sea level to Mount Everest in 5 minutes, and that's what the patient suddenly looks like. So that happened in 2002, and it's happening again. So what is going on there? If there's no signs of a viral infection, what is going on, and why are we finding COVID in some of these bloodstreams? And so what seems to be happening, whether we're looking at SARS, MERS, or this, is a constellation of events that are happening in the bloodstream to induce a high-altitude-like injury or hypoxic injury to the whole system. And then eventually, if we don't fix that problem, they're going to fill their lungs with fluid because we didn't reverse the hypoxic thing. And if you put them on a respiratory machine, you actually just made the situation worse, because forced oxygen is very noxious. High-pressure oxygen is very noxious to the tissue of the lungs. If you push oxygen in and the bloodstream still can't bind it, you haven't fixed the hypoxemic event. And so you're pushing an oxidative injury, which is inflammatory, onto a tissue that can't absorb the oxygen at the tissue level. And so we know we're seeing extraordinary rates of death. 88% of people on a respirator in New York are dying. nowhere else in the world did we see levels that high of mortality. And so we are part of the problem when we keep thinking that we have a respiratory failure event. SARS to now, that's 18 years of science, has shown us that this is a hypoxic injury, not a viral infection type thing. So if it was a virus that was overwhelming your system, you would see your immune system respond appropriately. Fever can happen downstream in COVID, but it's not at the beginning of this infectious process. It's actually in week 2 that you tend to see the fevers spike up and all that. Again, 5,000 people presenting in New York, their body temperature as a population is stone cold normal at presentation. It's not until days later, when their fluids have filled with lungs in a hospital environment and now they have secondary bacterial infection, that they get the fevers. And so there's downstream signs of overwhelm to the system, hypoxic injury, and an accumulation of infectious-like symptoms, but that's not the presentation. And so as soon as we come to terms with this as a medical community, I think we're going to save lives really rapidly. We need to treat this like a hypoxic injury. And we have a lot of interesting data out of there, and I'm making a film right now on what I think is going on. So and what I think is probably very incomplete because my clinic's not allowed to be open right now, which is so ironic. If you think you have a hospital overload capacity, then don't close all the clinics. Like don't say that all the clinics out there that aren't associated with a hospital are suddenly non-essential. If you don't want an overloaded hospital system, keep the clinics open, but that's an aside. And so I haven't been able to treat those patients with this, but I offer it to any physician to start to explore this. Is we need to treat this as a hypoxic injury similar to cyanide poisoning. And so we need to start to put in the pieces to change the shape of the hemoglobin, which we can do. We know how to treat cyanide poisoning. Cyanide poisoning happens to present exactly like COVID syndrome, which is non-febrile, blue patient, with signs of liver failure and hypoxemic injury to the organs, developing later into respiratory death. And so we have a very well established treatment plan for cyanide poisoning, and it's 3 quick injections of a cyanide kit, and you're using things like sodium nitrate in there to change the shape of hemoglobin so that it can bind through methemoglobin the oxygen again. And so we have an FDA-approved mechanism of treating cyanide. We should turn that kind of mindset to that. Now, am I right? Is that going to fix the problem? It may be more complicated than that, but until we start treating the hemoglobin as an initial injury, we're never going to solve the downstream infections that are happening, because people aren't dying of COVID again. They're dying of secondary pneumonias that are bacterial in nature downstream, and some of them are dying of a hypoxic organ failure, but they're not dying of a virus per se. You don't see any of the signs in those 5,000 patients.
All right.